Welcome to another edition of Inside the War Room. Ryan Ray here, as always. Thank you so much for tuning in. And hey, if you're new to the program, go drop us a 5-star rating and review wherever you hear this wonderful podcast, as we are trying to turn them out as much as humanly possible. Today's guest is someone I've got to know somewhat on LinkedIn, as good as you can get to know someone on LinkedIn. And I've already apologized for mispronouncing his name. Longtime listeners of the podcast know that enunciation of names is not my strong suit, but I will try my best. Laurent Segalen, I think, is how I'll let you correct me if I'm however you want to say it, but I'll just call you good sir moving forward. It's great to have you on. Tell folks you've got podcasts and investments and all kinds of energy stuff. Tell folks a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's really a pleasure to talk with you, because also I'm a big listener of your Texas Oil and Friends podcast. I love your show. I love your flow. I think that the number of things you say, there's a lot of inaccuracy, but that's part of the charm. So my name is Laurent Segalen, and I'm a Franco-British clean energy investment banker. I'm based in London. And for the past 25 years, I've traded carbon credits, clean power. I have a broker wind farm, solar parks. And I mean, generally, I'm interested in the energy transition. Of course, in order to do the energy transition, you need to know where do you transit from. And of course, you need to know what's going on generally in the electricity market. So you need to know where gas is, you need to know where coal is, where nuclear is. And of course, more recently, but that's quite recent, it's the whole development of the electric transportation, which is going to touch oil or not. Large debate. And so, yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Well, one of the reasons I created this podcast is to have on these conversations. It's called a war room. So you can come in here, you can have, I don't want to say difficult conversations, but you can have conversations. I had a guest on a few weeks ago, and he got off, and he goes, I really appreciate the fact that you realized I was arguing with your argument, not with you personally. And I said, exactly, that's what we're here for. So I'll let you have the floor, sir. You said I get a lot of things wrong. You pick one, and we'll get into it.
No, it's really a matter of where you talk from. Because if you talk from Texas, and if I talk from Europe, or if I talk from China or India, or geography counts.
Absolutely.
You are in a place where you're going to produce much more energy than you can consume, or you're going to produce that type of energy. Of course, you're going to do whatever it takes to promote it. If you talk to someone from Alberta, they're going to explain you that the oil sands are the most environmental and best oil in the world. Sure. And if you talk from the Chinese coal miner from the Shanxi province, he will tell you that coal is absolutely wonderful. But if you are the problem we have in Europe, and it's also the case in other places, is we need to import 80% of our energy.
80%.
So, yeah, 80%. And we'd like to import it from nice places like Switzerland, where they give you chocolate. But you need to import it from the Russians. You need to import it from the Saudis, and you have two options. You have the U.S. Navy, and people get in line and they obey or not whatever you suggest, or you don't have a big military and you need to play along with people you don't necessarily want to spend your vacation with.
Yes.
So if you are in a context where you're an energy importer, and if I remember well, 10 years ago, it cost Europe $500 billion per year to import energy, you'll do whatever it takes to lower the bill. Right. And that's why that was a very powerful driver behind the energy transition. Now, of course, on the top of that, you get the Greens, which is, a moral movement which has been around for ages, still continue to be there. But on its own, the Greens are not very vocal, but and it's great in a certain way, but they are not sufficient to move the needle. They are sufficient to move the needle if you have some investment and you have some clean technology which cost, is comparable at least to existing technologies.
So let me tell you my general energy policy to make sure, or philosophy on energy policy, make sure that see where we disagree maybe. So I am energy agnostic, I say. So if you are in the remote village of Zambia, how you consider energy policy and what energy source to bring in is fundamentally different than New York City. So that's generally my philosophy. So in Texas, obviously, we have a lot of oil, as you mentioned. But if you're talking about the remote bush in Zambia, how I would think about energy would work differently there. To your point about Europe, and we talked about this a little bit offline, but the thing with Europe, I don't really have a problem with Europe, whatever they want to use. I think there's a couple things. There's one thing to say that we want to move from this type of energy to that type of energy and not tell everyone what's involved, right? So if you want to move to EVs, well, let's talk about the impact of rare earth mineral mining and where those come from. If it's a moral thing, if it's a moral thing, if it's an economic thing, go ahead.
That is extraordinary.
What's extraordinary?
For 100 years, the refining industry has been using cobalt. Nobody cared when Exxon or Chevron, they use cobalt in their refineries where the cobalt came from. But all of a sudden, you put a bit of cobalt in a battery, and everybody tells you that, oh my God, it comes from this, child labor in the middle of Congo.
No. Okay, right. Yes. So the point would be is that if you're saying that you are concerned about the environment, well, let's have a conversation about the environment. And
that's fine.
Right. And so it's not saying that one is better than the other. It's that in the U.S., I can't speak to Europe. In the U.S., there's not much debate over what happens when you switch from A to B. It's just, hey, let's go from A and let's move to B, and then everyone talks as if B has no environmental consequences or there's no downside to B. And that, to me, is the concern with the energy policy discussion. Not to say what you're pointing out is, well, oil and gas have used this, and now you oil and gas guys are mad that the EV guys. Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying what we're being told is that there's no drawbacks to the EVs, and it's like, well, that's not true. And I can't speak for what happens in Europe.
I agree. I agree. EVs, you need to mine stuff.
Mm.
You're going to use nickel coming out of Russia. You're going to use cobalt coming out of Congo. You're going to use lithium coming mostly out of Australia, and all this is going to be processed in China. I agree. There's no perfect solution.
Right.
But where we disagree is that you say I'm an energy agnostic, and I'm going to say I'm an energy agnostic as well,
okay,
provided you factor in the externalities. If you say, look, coal, I look at the price of coal, I look at the price of gas, I do my math, coal's a bit more expensive or a bit cheaper. But if you don't account for the carbon emissions, if you say the price of CO2 is zero, that I disagree. And in Europe, the pricing carbon has been very popular for the past 20 years, because when you get the price of gas or the price of coal or the price of anything else, you've got the price including the price of carbon, which is, by the way, not determined by a government, it's determined by the market. So that, I say, look, price carbon, and then I'm happy to be agnostic once it's priced.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you look at an emerging market and you're saying that we have to price carbon, okay, I would say my pushback to that would be is, well, you're now making energy more expensive for the people who least can afford it by pricing this carbon in. So how would you respond to that?
Well,
who should pay that bill?
Well, frankly, that exactly the type of speech I listened 20 years ago when we put the carbon market in Europe. And I was part of the people who helped the commission to draft the regulation. And they say, oh, the price are going to go through the roof and so on. No, it's not true. 20 years has proven that the price of carbon has not changed a dime, has had zero impact. It's just about, because right now the good thing is the price of alternatives has become so low that in fact the pricing carbon just accelerate the transition. The transition is going to happen whether you like it or not.
Okay.
The question is, do you want the energy transition to happen in 5 years or 10 years? Carbon allows you to, because they price the externality, to transition faster. Now, if the price of, look, okay, let's take some crazy technologies like, geothermal or wave or tidal. Those stuff will never be economic. Carbon move the needle 20%. But if you need for, whatever, you need 600% subsidies, that I disagree. I want clean, but I want cheap.
Mm-hmm.
And the good thing is now, solar and wind, they're dirt cheap. Now,
Yeah.
it's not that simple, because what happens when the sun doesn't shine? What happens when the wind doesn't blow? I agree. It's very difficult to run the system 100%.
Mm-hmm.
But in Europe, we've been running the whole system for almost 2 years. We have 50% renewables.
Mm-hmm.
50%. And how do you do that? There's a lot of digital. There's a lot of the progress which has been made in technology to harness the fact, tomorrow there's going to be too much wind or not enough wind. You have the hydros, you've got the system, you've got the batteries. I would have accepted this type of speech 20 years ago, but the amount of technological progress which has been done allows any system to live with probably 50% renewables. I agree. Going to 100%, that's much more difficult.
Okay.
That's much more difficult. So we need backup systems, and this is where gas is going to be.
Okay, so maybe help me connect this point. You're saying that what I'm saying is was said 20 years ago, and that the price is so cheap. Then why do we need to factor in the price of carbon if it doesn't matter? If these other sources are so cheap, then why do we need to factor in the price of carbon? Is it
because if you believe in climate change or not, if you believe climate change is a political imperative or not. And
okay. Well,
but if you say climate change is just an invention of of greenies, I respect, but I will disagree. For me, climate change is important. The whole ESG movement is important. You will point to all the excess of the energy ESG movement, and I will agree with you. But I will say this is also a very powerful trend. So at some point, the polluters need to pay something.
So I would say that we'll talk about climate change in a second, because that's an interesting discussion I definitely want to have with you. But let's talk about malaria. Let's talk about infant death. Let's talk about what's actually happening right now, right? And so climate change is something that we can talk about. But is it 2050, 2080, whatever it is? But today there are people dying of malaria, people dying of childbirth. They're dying because they can't have clean water. So how do you how do you balance today's needs versus the potential threat 30, 50, 70 years from now?
Well, malaria, Bill Gates taking care of it. Well, I hope he does.
Okay.
Look, thank you for asking me a question about solving the world's problem. I'm just trying to, everything I've done in the past 25 years was just trying to accelerate the transition, but not by burning too much of public money, because public money is precious. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it's your taxes, and you need to have, a legal system. You need to have roads. You need to have hospitals. You need to take care of all the sick people. So having, too much public money sunk into, crazy, stupid technology, I disagree. Yeah, now, if you say, how do I solve the people? Look, how do you solve the problem in Ethiopia? How do you solve the problem in Burma? Look, this problem everywhere, and there's been problem everywhere all the time.
Right.
There's only one country where there's zero problem, no greens, and everything is beautiful. It's called North Korea, and I'm not interested.
You don't want to go there for vacation?
No, sir.
I want to go. I really want to go. I want to go take a look. I'll be honest with you.
No, and apparently the ticket Houston to Pyongyang is quite cheap. There's the return ticket, which is very expensive.
It's a one-way deal. It's exactly. A one-way deal. Well, and so obviously, I'm not trying to get you to pin you down and say, "Hey, solve all these problems." Again, I think the depth that these conversations have, and of course, we can't solve it all in an hour, is that when you talk about the climate change concerns, there are legitimate concerns today, and it's like, okay, how do you balance these things? And my concern from geography, you're saying, is that when I go to Africa, what I hear is a lot of ideals that are being imported from the West, and they're not actually practical on the ground as where these particular people are at. I'm a little bit concerned that we are trying to force stuff that's a little bit premature for some of these areas. Now, with that being said,
Okay, no. So I can talk about that.
okay,
Because if you look at Africa, I mean sub-Saharan Africa, what they do right now, they're going to chop the trees or they're going to use diesel, which costs them a fortune.
yes, agreed.
And what everybody's trying to get, it's a little solar panel on every roof with a little battery, and you can electrify all of Africa like this.
Yeah,
And this is clean, this is green, and this is the cheapest.
So me and you would sit there and go, that is a agnostic approach to a very simple problem.
It's happening, and it's happening.
Right.
There is zero government policy.
Yeah.
You have something in Kenya called M-Pesa. Basically, people don't have a bank account. Their bank account is in their mobile phone.
Yes.
So they arrive in the market, they deliver their flowers or their fruits or their meat or they get credited on their mobile phone. And then after they can go and buy the solar panel. And because they know, I don't know how the system works in detail, but they can go with their solar panels, on there, and they will get a microcredit for 2 years. And that exists. You don't need to have global leaders to meet and so on, because it's just happening.
Agreed. I think yes, very much. The first time I went to South Africa, they took me by some of the lower income areas, and I think the government in this part of the country, at least, had subsidized hot water heaters to go on these houses with a solar panel, so they could have hot water in the house. And it was like, okay, that's a solution that seems to be pretty easy, pretty cheap, pretty something you could replicate. And you just look out across this little village, I say village, whatever you want to call it, and there's just thousands of little hot water heaters on top of these houses with solar panels. And so there are solutions like that we should definitely be talking about. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when I was in Johannesburg, every time I've been, there's a thick smog that just sits over it from all the mining and stuff they do. What are your thoughts about, so South Africa would be probably the most prosperous of the sub-Saharan nations. What are your thoughts about nuclear power plant being rolled out more widely across the world?
Look, it's everybody's dream, but problem of nuclear is that it's awfully expensive. I mean, when I say awfully, it's awfully expensive. I mean, look at in the US, you've got the Votel plant. It's like 10 years delay. And I mean, this Westinghouse. I mean, you've got your best nuclear engineers working on it.
How much from a regulation?
They have a 10-year delay, and the budget, which was like $15 billion, is $23 billion.
Right.
Now, I don't see anyone in Africa being able to, pay for nuclear plant. Plus, you just don't press a button. You need nuclear engineers. You need to know where you're going to get your uranium from. You need to go how to recycle your uranium and not build nuclear weapons with it. Because whatever they tell you, the nuclear industry, the civilian and the military, they are good buddies. And the most absurd thing I hear about nuclear is in Iran. In Iran, they are building a nuclear plant. They've got the biggest gas reserves on the planet. They share it with Qatar, the biggest. I mean, Texas is like, it's a minnow compared to Iran. It's like the guy, he has a warehouse full of Pepsi Cola, and he say, but I need a Coca-Cola. Say, no, guys, I mean, you've got your whole warehouse. It's absurd. So, of course, they don't do it for power. They do it for,
sure,
for the weapons.
So how much?
So nuclear is like, I mean, in the UK, they are building one new plant. It costs, because we know exactly how much it costs, because the government had to give a tariff. They gave a guaranteed tariff for 35 years, inflation adjusted, so every year it creeps up, and it's 24/7. So even when it's sunny, even when it's windy, you still need to pay for that tariff. The price right now is $150 per megawatt hour. The price in Texas is $30. The price on PGM is $40. So those people, they get guaranteed 3, 4, 5 times the market price for 35 years, inflation. And the best thing is they can't even make money on the construction. So, I mean,
Right.
look,
So you have the large plants, which are super expensive. And I got two questions. One, how much do you attribute that to being over regulation, or do you think the regulation on nuclear is appropriate? Two, what are your thoughts on kind of the microgrid? Not microgrid. The what they
the
call
micro,
modular. Yeah,
the small modules.
yeah, the micro modules on nuclear. So what are your thoughts on
Okay, so when you do nuclear, the thing is you need to build everything. It's not something you can manufacture in a plant. Everything is a one-off. It's like you build a bridge, or you do a tunnel, and then because of Fukushima, and they saw the disaster of Fukushima, they say, okay, maybe there's one chance every 1 million years, they tell you, or one chance every 10,000 years. The problem is it happens every 20 years. But okay, let's assume it's one every 100 years. But the cost of Fukushima was 10 billion. That was the cost of the plant. The cost to Japan to clean up the mess was 200 billion, which means that no insurer will ever insure a nuclear plant. It's all public money.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
It's all public money. So the risks are tiny. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
But if there is a problem, the costs are like crazy. I mean, the costs are insane. And it's just to produce electrons. Now, I understand when there was nothing else, and it was the 50s and the 60s, you might want to do it because you say, but that was the time where they would, in the world, they would produce 50 nuclear plants per year. Mm-hmm. Now it's down to 2. Mm-hmm. So you don't have the effect where you can have the prices go down. Now the dream that you're going to build something small and it's going to be cheaper, it doesn't work. In fact, this is typically a case where the bigger it is, the cheaper it is. So you're not going to make them any cheaper. So I know there is New Scale and there is the Terra Power from Bill Gates, but it's in 10 years' time. Look, good luck. It's Bill Gates' money. He's going to burn it or not. I don't want to say it's not going to work. I'm saying that's fine. It's his money. Good for him.
What would you say to maybe China, India, Pakistan, these large population countries who are, at various levels between those three, industrializing? Would you suggest that maybe those type of countries who are going to have huge power sources as they become more wealthy consider something like nuclear, despite the exorbitant costs?
Yeah. It makes sense. I mean, if you take Japan, Korea, northern eastern China, India, I'm a bit less sure because India, the solar resources are exceptional. Yeah. For big load centers, it probably makes sense to have 25-30% of nuclear power on the grid, but it is not a market based. It's a decision, politics, and it's going to be done in conjunction with the military. And if you look at the only big countries that do nuclear are sitting at the UN Security Council. Mm-hmm. Because the price is so horrendous that you will never find a market approach to justify it. But if you say, I want to run the world or co-run the world, I've got my nuclear weapons, then you can justify having a civil nuclear industry. Okay. But that's how I see it. Now, of course, people, they explain me a lot of things, but the cost just don't make sense.
Okay, so let's talk about Russia a little bit. You mentioned
Russia.
The Ruskies. Now, let me just, before we get started, I have made this abundantly clear to anyone who listens to me. I think the Ruskies pose zero threat, and I say zero threat, legitimate war threat to the U.S. Zero. None, nilch, nada. That doesn't mean they might, fire off some crazy thing here or there in Afghanistan or whatever. But as far as a legit security risk to our country, none. Now, that being said, in the U.S., you talk about geography, so go back to geography. In the U.S., this is how it's phrased. Them Europeans want to buy that Ruski gas, and they want us to defend them. Now, okay, that's how it's phrased.
But the US, at the same time, the US buy Russian oil. There's no problem. There's no problem with that. The guys in Boston,
so
in Boston, they've been importing Russian gas all winter long. That was fine. But the European can't get Russian gas, but the US can get Russian oil. Okay, fine.
Okay, but we're not asking the Europeans to defend us from the Russians. But I don't think we need defense. Give me your stance on just Europe importing energy from Russia. Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it's a bad thing? Is there a real threat from Russia from your perspective? I'm just curious how you think about that, because to me, I think it's a lot of Cold War era stuff that's being pushed forward today. And I think most of that's just smoke and mirrors. I'm in the minority position here, so I'm curious your thoughts.
Okay, so first of all, let me tell you a funny story. It was like 10 years ago. I was working for a Japanese bank, which had lended money to Ukraine, 500 million to finance clean projects. And because I was in London, that was, basically they sent me to Kiev to kind of check where the money has been properly invested into, redoing district heating or clean transportation. I mean, there's a big Excel sheet full of projects that they were supposed to finance. And then so I arrived there, and as a banker, we had a kind of businessman. Guy had no business card or anything, but he was our fixer. And he comes and he says, "Oh, I like your bank very much," and so on. So we go to the ministry, and he enters without any appointment in the Minister of Environment, and he tells the minister, "Please get us 2 coffees." And he sits and say, "Oh my God, where am I?" And he looks and say, "Yeah, I think the minister can tell you where your money is, but let me tell you, your money's gone." I say, "What do you mean your money's gone?" Well, I mean, the moment he landed, we just took it, some went to the Russians, some went to our friends, some went to Switzerland. I say, "Look, I can't go back and, tell that story." I say, "Just made it up. Just say we need 1 more billion or something for more projects." And I was like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" And then after, they brought me to this great restaurant, which was on a terrace overlooking that great river, like gigantic river, as big as the Mississippi, called the Dnieper. They have in Kiev, and there were a lot of, pretty girls. I mean, you could sense the money. And come this guy, and the guy is like, is like exhausted. I say, "Sorry, I'm the Minister of Finance. I just spent the whole day talking with the IMF. I have no clue what they're talking about." And I say, "Oh, that's going to be a painful day." I say, "No, the painful thing starts now, because I own 4 disco, and I need to go to each of one of them to make sure nobody's stealing my money." So the Minister of Finance was, owned discotheques, and everything was like that. And Ukraine was not really a country. It was managed by, it's not like the mafia influenced the government. It's the mafia is the government.
It's government, yeah.
But they were nice guys. I had a great time. We really had a great time. Those people are great. I had a great time, and I came back and I made a very complex report explaining that we needed to investigate further or something like this. But
give another billion.
Yeah, but that's where you realize that and that was 10 years ago, but all those people were living out of stealing Russian gas.
Yeah.
And I think at some point the Russians made the calculation, and somehow they were stealing about $1 billion per year. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knows. And they realized that if they bought German politicians, it would be cheaper, which is what they did. And, they hired a former chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, is on the payroll of Gazprom. and they have the Hotel Adlon in Berlin, which is owned by Gazprom. It's just next to the Bundestag, and basically everybody is on the payroll of Gazprom. But guess what? I mean, the Germans, they're very organized. So it costs 100 million a year, but everything is delivered on time, on budget. Everything's perfect. Was the Ukrainian, they were stealing, because if you look at the gas quantity, it's just the Russian did not want to send their gas to Ukraine. The quantities are the same. Even now, the quantities are a bit lower despite the price of gas is expensive in Europe. So I can understand that between Ukrainian oligarchs and German politicians, the Russian decided to deal with German politicians. I mean, it's not about defending NATO and everything. It's a sound business decision.
So that's a great story, by the way. That's a great story. I got to come to London and hang out and get the real stories that are off the record. Okay, so how do the German people perceive this? Because last year there was a story, the Wall Street Journal, talking about the German business leaders were complaining to the German politicians about Chinese business practices and how Chinese have been stealing, their IP and stuff like this. And the journal tried to tease out the idea, which was essentially the German leadership is in a tough spot because if they make the Chinese mad, the average citizen will be impacted by the price of imports or not being able to get what they need or whatever.
But no, it's about the cars. It's all about the cars. It's all about the cars. Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, they send so much cars in China, and the Chinese can be very hitchy. And if the Chinese government just can decide to revoke whatever they have in China, like overnight, and that's really bad for Germany. It's really about the cars. It's not about the price of T-shirts. Now, if you go back to Russia, historically, and I know there've been world wars, and Hitler and Stalin and everything, but if you look over a long period, Germany and Russia, they have a decent relationship. And if you take the biggest Tsar, Tsarina, she was a woman. Catherine the Great, she was born in Germany. And, so there's a lot of interaction between the German, who are somehow the manufacturers, and Russians who are providing the raw material. Those two economies are kind of intertwined. And of course, if you have war, everything stops. But if you just let geography and mutual interest play its game, they find a lot of joint interest.
Yeah. So my question, I guess, would be is how do the people on the ground, the average citizen in Germany, like when you talk about this stuff, if this was going on in the U.S., the right would be upset if it was the left, or the left upset with the right. During the last presidential election, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, being tied up with Ukraine was a big story.
He went to Kiev. he met my buddies. Yeah.
Was he in that meeting with you?
No, unfortunately, I must have been in the ground floor. He must have been on the 5th floor.
But how did the German citizens think about the Russians, hiring their politicians? Is that kosher? I mean, just from the American perspective, it sounds weird, but I'm curious. That's normal.
Yeah, look, I mean, everybody wants to have the moral high ground, but at the end of the day, you need your energy, you need to sell your Volkswagen. I mean, you need to be pragmatic. Mm-hmm. So, I know, Ryan, you want purity all over the world. Reality is a bit messy,
Oh, it's very messy. I don't deny that. I'm just trying to. I'm just more curious. Is how it's viewed, because one of the things when you travel different countries, as you have done, you talk to people and you get their perspective on how things are. Like you're telling me your perspective on stuff is different than my perspective, and so I always love to hear what people's perspective are on things. Not that whether I agree or not, it's not really relevant. I'm just genuinely curious because that interprets, and this is going back to maybe some of the energy discussion stuff, but this how you perceive the world and how you perceive how the world should be ran and is ran and all those things impacts how you think about larger societal issues or energy policy or whatever. And so something like this, I don't have a problem with the Russians selling gas to whoever wants to buy it from them. I think, to be quite honest with you, the U.S. should be out of the sanctioning business. That's my stance. It has been for some time. And so, if the Iranians want to sell, Russians want to sell. I don't. I think all that should be. That's just hogwash. So I don't know. I'm always.
No, but look. Let's look. You talk about economics and being agnostic. The LNG ports in Europe, they run at 25% capacity. Why? Because Russian gas is cheaper.
Right.
It's cheaper. So, if the US say, oh, don't buy Russian gas, fine. Send me your gas cheaper than the Russians. We'll buy everything you want.
Well, no, right. So I think so the argument,
that's
right,
it.
Right. So the argument from my perspective is quite simply, okay, that's fine. If the Russians, like I said, I don't care. If you want to buy from the Russians, that's fine. But the U.S. should not be in the NATO business, because if you can buy the gas from the Russians and there's no security threat, which I think is very minimal, if anything, then we don't need to be in the NATO business. And to me, that would work hand in hand with what you're saying. I don't have a problem with you guys buying from the Russians or from whomever. I just don't see the need for us to spend military dollars to, quote, protect the Europeans. That's
no, fine. If the US want to go to destroy NATO, fine. and the whole system will reorganize itself.
Yeah, but that's what my question early on was, that you don't perceive.
But NATO's very hollow, in the sense that NATO ceased to have any real. How can I put that? In French, we say raison d'être. Mm-hmm. Reason for being. Mm-hmm. After the fall of the Berlin Wall. Mm-hmm. And that's like everywhere. Organization, they try to find a new reason to exist.
Right.
So look, I think the US like to have I think the US have military presence in 100 countries in the world.
Yeah.
They like it.
Of course they do.
So but if the US say, okay, we're getting out of NATO, the fact that you have NATO allows the US to have a huge influence. The moment you say, okay, I'm done with NATO, it costs me too much, you're going to lose some influence. And so people probably, they're balancing how much NATO costs and how much do I get from it. And maybe it makes sense to just continue it the way it is. I don't think it costs that much, to tell you the truth.
Oh, no, I don't think it costs that. Relatively speaking, it probably didn't cost that much either.
It costs much less than Afghanistan.
No, right.
All those, Iraq, all those.
No. Relatively speaking, I would suspect it's minimal. It's minimal dollars. To me, it's more of we just waste so much dang money. This is what are we doing here? First, we should stop the wars, all of them. That'd be my first thought. And then second is stuff like this. We're just wasting time and money. It is about influence. It is about the reserve currency. And most Americans don't understand how much U.S. foreign policy is tied to protecting the reserve currency far more above than it is anything else.
Yeah, but look, I'd rather have dollars than bitcoins or Chinese yuan, because at least I know who's in charge. There's the rule of law. There's the Fed. At least I can see who's in charge, and not a guy, a hacker behind his computer, being in charge of the reserve currency.
You brought up Bitcoin. I'm curious because right now the U.S. is going through this big debate over, is it the worst thing for the environment, or is it great for decentralization? How is Bitcoin perceived in the European side of the things?
Okay, so it's very simple. If you're above 40, which is my case, it's the worst stupid thing. I don't understand shit about it. It's super polluting. If you're below 40, it's the most amazing thing. Everybody should be crypto. It's generational.
And are there other coins like Ethereum or whatever? Do those have much play in Europe, or is it pretty much Bitcoin?
It's really Bitcoin. But the way Bitcoin was conceived makes it extremely energy intensive, because the guys who did that at the beginning, they had no clue it would turn into hundreds of billions of dollars of assets.
Sure.
But no, what we're saying is we're trying in a lot of, going back to the energy, to use the blockchain, to back some transactions, or to I know, for instance, in London, which is a great place to move oil, Each shipment of oil, each boat is tracked by blockchain. So, you have a real traceability. So this is something I really believe a lot. Crypto assets, is generational. But look, it has been, I think that for a while, the government, they just let it play. And now that it's big, you start seeing crackdowns all over the place. In China, they closed the Bitcoin mines. There were 4 Turkish-based Bitcoin exchange. What can go wrong, on the Turkish? The 4 of them, the guys disappeared with the money. What can go wrong? And in the UK, there was this big stuff called Binance, and now it has become so big that the UK say, look, you're banned.
Yeah.
So look, that's what I think.
Yeah.
I think I'm an old man, and I think it's just outside my league. So, but if young people, they want to do it, fine. I'm open-minded.
Well, okay. So we'll wrap it up with this last question here. If you say that I'm currently 20 years behind on my talking points, what talking point will I be behind on 20 years from now? So where will energy be 20 years from now that we should be looking forward to?
Okay, so here I have written somewhere, and it's really a good way to conclude. It's the 8 rules of the energy transition by John Kemp of Reuters. And it's one of the best analysts. I mean, you can follow him on Twitter, John Kemp, Kemp. And his 8 rules are: energy systems are always in transition. So, I mean, always. There's always transition going on. Number 2, transitions driven by long-term economic and social forces are more powerful than politics. Which means, for instance, Trump did not want to hear about climate change. Under Trump, wind was up 50%, solar times 2, EVs times 6. So that's what I'm saying. Economic, social, more important than politics. Number 3, uptake of new energy sources and technology follows a S-curve. So every time you want to have a linear progression, you're going to see the S-curve works. And for EV, it's going to be the same. Number 4, transition usually play over decades, which is good for oil because oil is going to stay for a long time. Number 5, new energy sources increase total consumption by making energy cheaper and allowing it to use in new ways. Number 6, new sources are normally additive rather than substitutive, at least in the early and mid stages. 7, legacy sources can continue growing in absolute terms for decades, even as their market share shrink. 8, unmet global energy demand will require significant growth in energy for all or almost all sources over the next 30 years. So we need more energy. So that's it. But it's you can check on. I like this, which means it's complex. Everybody arrive with simple answers. It's going to be all green, or it's going to, green is useless, or this. No, this is. I mean, John Kemp is right. It's super complex. Plus, you've got geography and everything on the top of it. So sorry, I made a long monologue at the end.
Yeah, John Kemp, first off, has a daily email that if you like energy news and stuff, he sends out every morning or afternoon, I guess our time or whatever. It's great to follow along if you like kind of what he reports on. I'll link to his Twitter profile in the show notes so people can get that. If you could send me a link to that eight points, I'll also include that in the show notes. Where can people find more of your content? You have a podcast. It's Redefining Energy, I believe, is the show.
Yes, it is.
On Twitter today. I know you're on Twitter, so I found you on Twitter. So tell people where they can find you.
They can find me on LinkedIn. On Twitter, my handle is Megawattx Info. And so I have got this podcast I started in a pub 3 years ago with my friend Gerard Reed. And the first months we had 40 downloads, and I said, look, this is not going to work. Let's stop that. And it's just growing big now. We are reaching 200,000, and we do about half an hour twice a month.
Okay.
And we pick a subject we like. So, will all majors turn into energy majors? What's the economics of batteries? We've got soon one coming out of, on electric vehicles. We call it Tesla against the world. So yeah, so basically we babble for half an hour.
Hey, I know a little bit about babbling for a long time. So. Okay, we'll link to that and to your LinkedIn and Twitter profile in here. Thanks for hopping on. I really appreciate it. Enjoyed the discussion as always. And I'm sure we'll get you on again in the future.
Thank you, Ryan.